This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jaz Riley, Postdoctoral Fellow and incoming Assistant Professor in the Department of African American Studies at University of Illinois. In this conversation, we discuss the ongoing challenge of community for Black Studies research, the critical intervention made by emerging questions of gender for the field, and the politics of Black study in the contemporary university. Good afternoon, Jaz. How are you?
I'm great. How are you today, John?
I'm good. I'm really happy. It's midweek, end of September when we're recording this. Somehow still like 85, 90 degrees outside. Miserable start to the semester, miserable year of 2025. I don't need to rehearse all those things, but I've been really looking forward to this podcast conversation for a lot of reasons. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on Black studies, having done your PhD in African American studies. I think PhDs in the field, it's really important to get your voice on the podcast and really feature them. Also, as someone who does critical theory, very excited about that. And also, we were just talking, somebody from Memphis where I did my PhD. I have a kind of deep affection. You'll join Javette Ward, I think, as the only two Memphis people on the podcast so far. But long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I look forward to the conversation.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me. I proudly represent my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee. I love that place. And I'm very excited to be here. I think there are a lot of things that we could talk about when it comes to Memphis and Black studies, whether we're talking about theoretical study or Black studies as a lived praxis. So I am grateful to be in the company of Javette Ward. And, just a tidbit of nice information here. Hortense Spillers is also from Memphis, Orange Mound to be exact. I don't know if you would get her on the podcast, but hey, we can dream big.
I've been in correspondence with her. We just haven't, her schedule hasn't worked out with me, but I do know that she's from Memphis. She was given a keynote at a conference a few years ago and mentioned it. And afterwards, I was like, oh, Orange Mound, that's Penny Hardaway's neighborhood. And she was like, yes.
Yes.
When I was putting these questions together, I had to resist the urge to put in some Memphis-specific things, debate, different barbecue spots and parts of town and all of that. But I figured, let's go ahead and stay away from, intra-Memphis controversy.
The controversial stuff,
Yeah, cozy corner forever. That's all I got to say. So,
Tops Barbecue, but hey, you do you.
I would not, believe me, I would not say no to Tops. That's for sure.
Just going to put that out there.
That's good. So Cozy Corner, Tops, we already got those out there. I will also say, sorry, I'm making this, we're having a little bit of a side road, but my first job after I did my PhD at University of Memphis was in Houston. And I remember talking to a colleague who was going to he wanted to take me out to barbecue. And he was like, the difference between Texas and Memphis barbecue. And so we talked about that. And then he was like, it's the real Civil War. Pork or beef, mustard seed or tomato. And I was like,
oh, boy.
Who does beef and tomato when they had the choice for pork and mustard seed? But,
definitely not Memphis. We're going to say that.
I never had to get tenure in that department, so that was it.
Yeah, that is a conversation that I would be terrified to enter because, Houston is also really interesting because Houston, like Memphis today, anyways, also has a lot of transplants from New Orleans. So that's also impacting the barbecue scene. Yeah. But hey, Memphis will always win in my heart. So,
in your heart, in God's heart. Come on, elevate stakes here. Well, maybe this is already then going to be a part of how you get into this question, or maybe not. But, we'll have a chance to talk about how you imagine the field of Black studies, the portraits you work with, as well as how you think about your work in relation to it. But I wanted to start off with a more personal question and just ask you, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And always for me, the companion question to that, what keeps you invested and committed to the field?
Yeah, that is a very personal question. Um, what drew me to the field? I cannot say that there is anything necessarily formally that drew me to the field. I think it's just been kismet in a lot of ways. And I say the same thing about the profession, being a professor as well. I learned about Black studies in very informal ways. Throughout high school, I was a performing spoken word poet, and I went on these like unofficial tours with a lot of spoken word artists from the city of Memphis as well. And that's how I was introduced to university professors. And that's how it became a possibility for me to even think about enrolling in a university. And, my poetry was very much inspired by growing up as a Black person living in Memphis. I spent a lot of my summers in different parts of Mississippi. Memphis is a predominantly Black place. And the parts of Mississippi that I went to, like Jackson, Tunica County, Grenada, like they have large Black populations as well. So my world coming up was just very Black. And so when I entered formal university, I ended up at Tennessee State University, which was it is an HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee. I ended up in an English department, and the capstone project that I ended up working on while I was there was a project that was concerned about a controversy or a story that had become very controversial coming out of the city of Memphis, which is about a bunch of the rate of teenage pregnancies amongst Black girls in the city of Memphis. And that story drew a lot of ire internationally. And, Black girls from the city of Memphis were being condemned and called everything but their names. And I was really taken aback by responses to that story because I knew some of the girls that were referenced in the statistical data of that story, and I was really interested in parsing out the particulars of their narratives as opposed to allowing this really terrible generic story or generalizations about Black girls to persist and not have some kind of counter to it. That was my capstone project, and it was very much I was coming at things from what I know now is a social science perspective, but also coming through an English department and a department that, the courses that did veer into what we might characterize as Black studies were very much of a Pan-Africanist bent. My questions, because they were concerned with the lived realities of Black teen girls in the city of Memphis, required me to find methods of approach that would actually account for their experiences. So I think that's ultimately how I end up at something that we might formally call Black studies, because, if I can, to prevent from going long on this particular question, essentially, like those questions about Black girls in the South and about Black maternity and Black pregnancy, those are questions that ultimately follow me throughout the trajectory of my formal post-secondary education. So even from Tennessee State, I did a summer program at UCLA, the Bunch Humanities Institute, where I continued this line of thinking, where I really emphasized the Black maternal figure who emerged as this figure to tell a story about disaster through in Hurricane Katrina's immediate post-storm moment. I carried that project with me during my time at the University of California, Riverside, where I completed my MA. And ultimately, that project has stayed with me because the project that I complete for my doctoral dissertation at Yale is the Katrina Lexicon on the temporality of Black and gender. And here we are now, ultimately staring down a book proposal that is going to be that project. And I say, that that initial story around Black teen girls, Black pregnant or Black maternity and pregnancy follow me because ultimately my work I see now is interested in Blackness and its relationship to gender writ large. So I think that's moving through that trajectory of work. Ultimately, I had to find methods of approach that would take the living of Black life quite seriously. And that's how I end up in this field called Black Studies.
Thank you for that. It's super interesting, and I love it when projects persist across undergraduate, masters, PhDs, books. That sort of long engagement with the project is so. I mean, I think it produces really interesting and important work. So hurry up and finish the book so that we can all read it. I like I don't know if that was your title or the characterization of the book, but it's a great title, Katrina
Yes.
Lexicon. And but this already sort of maybe starts to answer the next question I had for you, which is, what is that field of Black studies in terms of, like, what is the portrait that you work with? What is the image in your head, your imagination of the field that's been able to sustain that kind of work across such different phases of life, but also of intellectual development? And I always ask this question, and so I'll put it this way, of course, in the context of its origin, which was this twin demand that founded the field, and it's a demand that has a tension built into it. There was the demand that there be a place to study Black life, the intellectual tradition. This was something that disciplinary departments hadn't done in the contemporary university in late 1960s, and Black Studies was going to be that place where you could study Black literature, history, art, etc. And so that's a part of how we think about Black studies today, thinking about the commitment to an intellectual tradition. But at the same time, in the late 1960s, that's the moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle that had abolished so many of those boundaries between, books and the people, between community and campus, between classroom conversation and political prescription. And I think we also have inherited that as part of the image of Black studies, the imagination of Black studies, which is a commitment to a certain prescriptive politics around Black liberation struggle. And I always want to say that there's a tension there because one is a commitment to intellectual life, one is a commitment to a particular kind of community struggle. And so sort of in that frame, what is that portrait of Black studies that you work with, and how does it orient you?
Yeah, I think understanding the origin of Black studies as a part of the U.S. institution that is universities and colleges, I think is critical for anybody who is aligning themselves in the field of Black studies. I think given my background, coming from a place like Memphis, which I broadly describe as the Black queer trans South, it's almost impossible for me to approach Black studies from a perspective that does not account for some kind of viable community orientation and community praxis. Because, I was introduced to methods that might be formally described as Black studies methods only when I entered into the university structure. But what I understand Black study to be, much like the social struggles that characterized the 1960s, where we saw the emergence and the formal construction of Black studies departments, at San Francisco State. It's born out of a mix of community struggle and concerns, and concerns for upper mobility, concerns for an intellectual tradition. I think in so many ways, I come to Black studies thinking the same thing out of, a community orientation. So what I mean by that is, before I get to a Tennessee State, UC, or a Yale, as a teenager, part of what I was introduced to while being a spoken word poet and performing around the city are collectives of people who were introducing me to different frames of thought that were very much rooted in the needs of the communities that we were a part of. I remember being like 15 or 16 years old and teaching outside of going to high school. I was teaching at a community school called the Marcus Garvey School. And I was assisting adults teach kindergarten through third grade students basic skills, basic reading and math skills. And we were teaching them these things using tools that reference Black thinkers. And I think that practice is far more potent today, and you have a lot of extra tools that are dedicated to this kind of teaching, a lot of children's books that are actually specifically written for children of that age. But at that point in time, we were having to kind of extract stories and make them children ready. And that's, a direct line of like dealing with community and an active practice of Black study as I understand it today. So that is to say, like, my upbringing is one that suggests my formal training has only ever been a supplement to the work and the living that I've done outside of the university. So that's also how I approach Black studies. Like, it's embedded in a community praxis and orientation. And that's for me personally. And I have, matriculating up through the PhD and now, moving towards the faculty side, I've definitely been exposed to a number of people and a number of books and different ideas around how Black studies should be approached, if it always has to be community oriented or community first. Like, how does it actually, that leaves me with the question of like, how does Black studies actually take seriously its relationship to institutionalization in particular? Because I understand the field, whether we're coming at it from, the contributions that Carol Boyce Davies has given us thinking about the origins of the development of the field, or someone like a Martha Biondi, and in so many ways they're having a similar conversation. The community-based struggles are always a part of the origin story of Black studies. And the idea that would somehow become peripheral or be less than central to Black studies is an idea that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I also know that, there are a number of my peers who are more interested in privileging a Black studies that takes more seriously its relationship to the institution or to the university. And I think that that's a curious and interesting position to have, because I do think that we have to take seriously the ways that the university itself has. Some people think it's lent credibility to a field like Black studies, and some people think it's harmed Black studies. I think this gives that orientation, or our different orientation, gives us an opportunity to really try and have an honest conversation about that kind of tension that exists, as opposed to running away from it. And so if I, had to expand on how I approach Black studies, other than, as I've already stated, with community being at the center of whatever it is that I do in the formal field of Black studies, the discourses that define Black studies, the multiple subfields being a supplement to that, I'm also not afraid of like leaning into the tension of asking, like, what does it mean to take seriously Black studies relationship to the institution? And I think that's a question that that's a tension that we actually have to lean into quite seriously in our current climate, where like Black studies is under such stringent direct attack from multiple angles. I don't think that it benefits us to lean only into an orientation or positionality that still privileges the university. But I also think, if people who do privilege that position are now understanding or feel like they have to lean more into the space of a community orientation because they're concerned about, the implications of privileging the institution, I think what that means for them is they cannot trivialize or treat the community orientation as if it is this sort of default or something to turn to because now formal Black studies in the university is under attack. Like, you actually have to take seriously how these two positions have always had some kind of a relationship, and we get to determine right now what is a more ethical way that relationship can be parsed out, as opposed to feeling like one is extractive of the other.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've said this a number of times in podcasts, but in this moment, and it's very strange that Ashley Newby and I, we have other people working with us, but when we started this podcast, it really was taking a chance or taking this opportunity to reckon with the history of the field, which was something that the 50th anniversary really couldn't, because that happened during the pandemic and people couldn't get together, and very muted that way. But it's become, in 2025, I think, more and more a documentation of either the last throes of Black studies or its struggle to stay alive. And across these conversations, I'm always struck by these moments that you've come to here, or that you've really foregrounded here, which is, who and what do we have in terms of allies in the field? Certainly it's not the university as an institution, right? It's last hired, first fired kind of stupid logic, right? That comes along with racism and the sort of belittling of area studies generally, but also disciplines themselves don't have that. Disciplines themselves don't have any natural affinity to defend us or to be there for us or to walk off the job if we're eliminated. And that, I think, brings us to what you've brought us to, which is that moment of saying, do we have allies that we would have had at the origins of the field, which is the very community and the community struggle, whether that's campus community of students or community thought more broadly. And that's a hard question to ask. I think it's a little bit of a dark night of the soul for the field, but it's an important one, right? Because it is having an honest reckoning with that. So I love the way you walked us right up to this contemporary moment that way. I appreciate that. And I think a lot of these conversations are leading a lot of people to think really hard about their own practices as departments, rather than individuals, or maybe as individuals, but as departments, and ask that question, where are we in 2025? How are we precarious? And how have we gotten so precarious around questions of community? Yeah. Well, let me shift a little bit and ask you about your own work. You work with gender and cultural studies, critical theory, historical sensibilities, and this collage of critical frames and orientations, open up so much for the field of Black studies. And so I'm interested, when you think about your own approach to inside the field, how you think your orientation fits in the history of Black studies, but also where do you think it opens up new horizons, or what boundaries do you think it pushes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As pointed out, and will probably be I'll continue to point it out, is my work for Black studies comes from a very deep embodied love of what I characterize as Blackened people, especially the Black, queer, trans South, right? It's a life full of living that I think we try to do the work of writing in the academy in ways that can sometimes feel reductive. And I think when it comes to my work in particular, I think characterizing it as gender studies, cultural studies, fused or tinged with historical sensibilities, I think, that's, and definitely a lot of critical theory. It's a pretty accurate description, but I think it's one that really holds true to what I understand to be the activist roots of Black studies, and that is also a part of the intellectual inheritance of a field like Black studies. But I think my work also wants to do it. I hope that it does the work of extending different frames of thought from subfields that constitute Black studies, like Black feminist thought, like what I'm characterizing as Black gender studies, right? And I hope that it does this in really interesting ways. One of the things I understand my work is doing, when I highlighted how I started at being concerned with descriptions of Southern Black girls and teenage pregnancy rates, and I end up at a concern for gender and its relationship to Blackness. I end up there because I am unpacking a lot of assumptions that I may have come in with when thinking about Black girls and teen pregnancy rates. And that has a lot of that thinking is done around presumptions of gender as, you know, actually being able to occupy some binary gender position or presumptions of what it looks like for people who come from certain backgrounds. I think growing as a scholar, I've moved away or have certainly begun to question those kinds of assumptions, those kinds of assumptions that suggest that there is any kind of stability in gender when it's relative to Blackness. So in that sense, I think my work really tries to push up against some tough and difficult ideas that Black studies writ large is probably still, I would say, is still grappling with around gender. Additionally, something that I think the origins of Black studies as a field is navigating is, and we've touched on this, is how much of the work that we do is in so many ways a form of institutional critique, as well as offers new stories or expands on stories or tells different stories. I tend to think, I don't understand how any of the work that we can do in a field called Black Studies does not have some kind of institutional critique baked into it, because we're always navigating the strictures of the institution itself to try and get the work done, whether that's having to go through IRB in order to get qualified to do field work, using historical frameworks in order to write cultural histories, etc. We are always having to have some kind of active negotiation of the university itself. So the institution or critique of institution, I feel like, is always a part of the work. It's just a matter of how much of that we want to bring to the surface. And in that sense, I think my work wants to push up against a sort of decorum of institutional life that urges us to not make institutional critique central to our work, when I think it's always already there. And I think that decorum, extends, the kind of pushing up against that decorum extends beyond the discourse itself, and it thinks about institutional life, how do we have these kinds of conversations and conferences and publications, job talks, things that shape what is deemed acceptable to Black studies. Some other things that I think my work kind of expands with regard to Black studies is it's really questioning, as we just pointed out, institutional futurity, thinking about the ways that we tell stories from certain collectives of Black populations, if our methods are simply extractive, what ways, if at all possible, can those of us who are working between the university and communities, and what ways can we have these sort of ethical orientations towards the people whose stories we're trying to tell, and that relationship not just be an extractive, harmful dynamic where the communities whose stories we are telling serve as just these people that we've extracted labor from, as opposed to being central interlocutors or the actual people who are producers of theory and expansive stories. I think I'm also interested in my work is also interested in naming or describing the limits of radicalism and how it comes up as performance in something called Black Studies, because of how Black Studies is positioned, because of its origins. The idea that Black Studies, some people take Black Studies and a community orientation to reductively mean there is a sort of activist bent to always want to undo the institution itself. And to some folks, it could be. And that plays out as a kind of radicalism in the university itself. And I'm really interested in the ways that that performance of radicalism emerges, and how it shifts our understanding of the concept of radicalism, because I think radicalism and the university are maybe opposed to one another. Yeah, I think also my work wants to insist that s- Black studies has to remain accountable to Black life beyond the institution. Also, I am leaning more into my internationalism as a Black studies thinker. Um, I've moved through spaces where I've been characterized as a nationalist thinker, and that really it got my wheels rolling to be like, well, what does it mean to call me a
Hmm.
nationalist? Like,
Mhm.
I grew up reading stuff by the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, but I was also very well versed in Alice Walker, and Audre Lorde coming up in high school. So, like, what does it mean to call me a nationalist thinker? And then I moved into a more Pan-Africanist perspective, which I found to be quite patriarchal. And then I'm definitely now more into a sort of internationalist bent. So regardless of either of those orientations, my work is asking us to think about those kinds of porous boundaries and what are the limits, but what are also the benefits of those kinds of boundaries. So, you know, in short, those are all of the ways that my work
Yeah.
is, pushing up against Black studies as well as expanding its horizons.
And I'm struck hearing you talk about your work and the history of the field, as I am struck by so many of the responses to this question, how some of the boundary pushing that people understand themselves to be doing ends up being actually the origins of the field. And so there's I think, an interesting kind of temporality of Black studies where, Pan-Africanism, I mean, you can't found Black studies. Its originators had such a deep Pan-African vision. But where does that how does that unfold, and how does the field become, as you say, like embedded, but also outside institutions and this drama? And one of the results, I mean, there are many things that come from that, I think, one of the results is that the origins of the field end up being boundary pushing in 2025. And what to do with that, I don't know. I mean, it's only, half century plus old. I mean, it hasn't had time as a field to go through that many phases, but that's a lot of phases to have gone through.
I think
I will just make, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, please.
The boundary pushing, I think it really depends on maybe the school of thought, maybe geographically. Like I think we would have to describe what we mean by boundary pushing, because I think it depends on the kinds of people who get recruited to certain kinds of PhD programs. Different programs have different cultures. I found that the moving through the UC system, to be frank, because I don't think I got into the details, but like moving through the UC system, I started at a summer program at UCLA where the thinkers that I was introduced to were folks like Richard Yarborough, Robin Kelly, Erica Edwards. I followed Erica Edwards to UC Riverside, where she helped create this like critical mass of Black studies thinkers for a period of time. I worked closely with her, Fred Moten, Nick Mitchell, Ashawn Crawley was there. And there were a slew of thinkers who are large or like loosely associated with Black studies in a number of ways, who came through there, whether as a job talk or as a part of the lecture circuit. But also, like, while I was in the UC system, I was just such a bright-eyed kid coming through that system. I made sure, I say system because I took so many classes at different UCs. I took a year-long seminar and I think an extra quarter, so like 4 quarters of work with Robin Kelly. And I was a part of the undercommons with a number of Robin Kelly students who were based in LA. I took like a year-long course with Tiffany Willoughby Herrard on Sylvia Wynter at UC Irvine. I had no clue who Frank Wilderson was, but I met Frank Wilderson doing political education classes at the Los Angeles Public Library. Had no clue that this man was like a professor at Irvine, and he was like this Afro-pessimist or he's like this key thinker in Afro-pessimism or what have you, because that's not how I met him. But I did soon learn who he was. I also, sat in on a number of lectures and audited courses with like Jared Sexton at Irvine. So like my that's my frame of thought, or different schools of thought that I was introduced to while in the UC system. Heavily theoretical, very much deeply invested in like pushing the boundaries, right? You meet a person like Nick Mitchell, who comes out of, is it Angela Davis's the School of
The History of
Consciousness?
Consciousness
The
program.
History of Consciousness. And who's quite literally, like, his dissertation, he's talking about how women's studies, or gender and women's studies, emerges in the university structure, and like the kinds of battles that it's up against, and the kinds of battles that it wages. Like these are the people whose thinking that I was eminently attracted to in the UC system. And then I come over to Yale and the host of schools along the Eastern Corridor, and my experience in these places is that it's less theoretically heavy than the UC system itself. It's very much deeply embedded in expanding the field of Black studies by trying to tell different stories. My experience is that it was less interested in offering overt institutional critique, but it is still there. Like when I got to Yale, I think I ended up with the people that I was ultimately intended to be with, because I was in an English department doing all of that stuff at UC Riverside, and then I was in African American Studies and American Studies at Yale. And what I learned, because of all of the people that I was exposed to in the UC system, is that an English department is far too limiting for what it is that I'm trying to do. And the lessons that I gleaned and found to be most important and critical for me were lessons gleaned from all of those different courses that I took with those different thinkers. Getting to Yale, then I was able to be, I had a better understanding that my work is inherently inter or non-disciplinary, and working with folks like Atav Nyong'o and Rod Ferguson, Crystal Feimster, and Daphne Brooks, people who are coming from different backgrounds, I felt less restricted in the project that I would ultimately produce, because I did not feel like these people were forcing me to produce like a heavily literary text, because I wasn't in an English department. And then I, working alongside a person like Rod Ferguson, who, from my understanding, has a bit of a social science background, but also his work is also institutional critique, as much as it is trying to tell different stories. So I think my lineage is one that really holds true to this idea that, yes, Black studies is about pushing boundaries, but I understand the pushing boundaries to be different coming from different depending on where you are located. You can't push boundaries the same way at a place like Yale in the ways that you can at a place like UC Riverside or UCLA or UC Irvine. And I think there are people who maybe don't understand themselves as being, to some extent, tools of the university, but there are people who will try to do the work of like reminding you that you can't push boundaries in certain ways if they feel like you're getting too far out of hand. So I agree with you that like I've always understood Black studies to always be pushing boundaries. But I think there are some people who are just now approaching and taking seriously the idea of Black studies pushing boundaries because of the position that we are now in as a field in this political climate. But it's always been a part of the work, whether it is a part of someone's peripheral narrative or whether it is the central critique that they are making in their work.
So let me just follow up on that a little bit and ask you about how that movement and doing that's quite like a tasting menu of the SoCal UC system there. Irvine, and UCLA, Riverside. You never made it down to San Diego, but close enough.
I did. I was there for a little bit.
Okay, so you even had UC San Diego. Great. But I'm interested, because you've already talked a good bit about your educational background, and I'm interested how, the fact that your graduate work and your current appointment are both outside of disciplinary orientations, and you sort of started to talked a bit about it here when you mentioned English department experience. And English departments, I think, are extremely interesting. I've said this on the podcast many times. So many English departments. I'm 49% in English here at University of Maryland, not 50, 49%. And it's kind of an area studies department, like a lot of English departments. It's really like a center of Black studies. It's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of work on Indigenous studies and queer studies. And so English departments can be like that, but they also can have a lot of disciplinary weight to them. But you have not come to your position, which is not a disciplinary department, through a discipline. You've come through Black studies to Black studies. And I'm interested in how you think that movement, not through a discipline, but through area studies, has shaped how you imagine and execute a research project, but also, if you want to talk a little bit about how it shapes how you approach a classroom.
Wow. Yeah. So, okay, maybe I'll start with the classroom space. So, I've taught classes in the field of English, and I've now taught classes in African American studies. Um, I think you can structure a classroom, you're teaching in the classroom. You kind of have free reign for the most part to structure that in a way that is most beneficial to you. I think having a Black studies background as informal as an outside of the university, community-oriented praxis, one that was a part of my UC experience, one that was a part of my Yale experience. Because to be clear, when I was at Yale, I lived in Philadelphia, and I did a lot of community-based work in the city of Philadelphia. I also did a lot of my writing and studying, I would say, essentially in community with other Black intellectuals in the city of Philly. And if you've been to Philly, when I say Black intellectuals, there is no way we're limiting that to people who only have institutional affiliation. Intellectualism is not something that is only about institution. You have your street corner historians, you have families who have these really deep, heavy archival collections that are just rich and important, and they absolutely refuse to hand those archival collections over to institutions. And that's a whole different lineage of thinking there that you can tap into. Philly is just rich in that way. That being said, because my orientation is community oriented first and supplemented by formal training, I do try to bring that into the classroom space. Something that I understand about Black living is that we have had to develop different kinds of literacies in order to move through the world. And I don't think that somehow changes when you get in a classroom space, because you might be a part of a disciplinary field like English that says you're supposed to privilege literature. In a Black studies classroom, what I've been very open and really brazen about is honoring the fact that Black living is based off of the development of multiple kinds of literacies. And I try to honor that in the classroom space by encouraging students to, one, tap into the different kinds of literacies that they are aware of as far as their individual development is. So something that I do is the first couple of days in the classroom, I have students complete some kind of a form, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be written. You can do this in the form of a video. You can do this in the form of a song, just tapping into the different literacies that are familiar to them, to explain to me what it is that they are interested in when it comes to the class, why they enrolled in the class, and what they hope to get out of it. But the thing that I'm trying to get them to do most is to highlight the ways that learning happens for them. And that may not always be in the form of a lecture or reading a dense text. It may not always be presenting something in the classroom space in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. So I give them free rein in in the first couple of days of class, I'm explaining to them, like, I'm supposed to communicate this information to you, but you might receive this information differently. So my job is to offer different formats in which I can convey information. So I do take advantage of different media forms. I'm interested in the podcast. I'm interested in music, TikTok reels. I'm interested in people's SoundCloud bites. All of these different things I try and bring into a classroom space to really connote to students that I understand that the strictures of the classroom space across the university might be such that they privilege one form of learning, but that does not have to be the case in this classroom because Black Studies does not privilege one form of learning. So that's one way that I see myself really being a Black Studies instructor in the classroom space. It's like honoring the fact that we have had to abide by different kinds of literacies. That's very much informed by my personal narrative. I have a number of nieces and nephews who I had to send a strongly worded text to one of my nephews this morning because I got an email from one of his teachers. But, that's something, the different literacies is something that I am actively always coming up against when it comes to dealing with my family, because these are young people who are in a classroom space and people are trying to discipline them to behave in a way that is unnatural for them. And so they end up not learning as much as they could in a classroom space. And I try to step in and intervene with them in a sense of trying to be like, let me tap into the ways that I see you actually learning and see if we can communicate the lesson that the teacher needs you to comprehend in a way that is actually effective for you. So that's another way that I see myself as being a Black Studies practitioner. It's not only in the formal classroom space. This very much has to do with the life that I live in the everyday with my family. When it comes to my work, my project, the Katrina Lexicon on the Temporality of Black and Gender, has very much been concerned with the long-term and immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina because, coming from Memphis, when Katrina hit, I was in high school and eventually I ended up in undergrad. There were a number of people who were displaced to Memphis and different parts of Tennessee, in Memphis and Nashville, where I ended up in undergrad. And so, those years of my life was very much colored by people who were displaced by Katrina and witnessing them go from feeling like they're only going to be in this part of the country for a small period of time to then them having to accept that they were never going to be able to return to the only place that their families knew to call home for generations. And that was a culture shock for them. I remember working a job for a nonprofit in Nashville where I encountered a number of Katrina's displaced Black population. And it wasn't just Black people. There were some displaced Vietnamese families who were there as well, and some displaced white families who were there as well. I was having to help them find housing and jobs in Nashville in particular. And they were going through a lot, having to really reconcile with that kind of displacement. So all of that is to say, like, my project, the Katrina Lexicon, is rooted in the actual experiences that I had had with people who were displaced by Katrina, as well as an attempt to kind of wrestle with the formal discourses that have come out about Hurricane Katrina. And as a Black Studies thinker in that regard, one of the things that I had to come to terms with pretty early on when I was at the Bunch Humanities Institute, before I even entered into an English graduate program, was that literature was simply, or an English department was simply not going to be enough for me to do the kind of work that needed to be done to tell a truer narrative around Hurricane Katrina, the kind of narrative that would be deemed unattractive to people who are not well versed in the field of Black studies, in the sense that it's not a story that is trying to paint a pretty picture about the long-term aftermath of Katrina for anybody who has an investment in a pretty picture, right? We're very much trying to tell the stories. I'm very much trying to tell the stories that have been deemed unattractive. And one way that I do that is like privileging the Black maternal. Like I enter my project around Hurricane Katrina with the privileging of the Black maternal and how this figure in particular really orients anything any conversation that we might have around gender and Blackness in particular. And in order to do that, I actually have to look at the ways that Black women and Black mothers and Black women associated with Black children in Katrina's aftermath were treated and the lived experiences that they have. And that is not something that I felt like could be done effectively in an English department because I was being encouraged to route those stories through literary texts. Literature is great in being able to have this really expansive look on certain dynamics of our lived experience in ways that don't have to come up against the ways that living would place limits on that kind of a narrative. Like, I think literature is really good for doing heavy theoretical lifting because there are less things to contend with than trying to tell a certain story about people's lived experiences. But that's also where I realized that I had to do more. I couldn't just lean on literary criticism to tell a story about Hurricane Katrina because these are stories that have not been written. And then there are lived experiences that we are told to be quiet about because it's an intercommunal experience that we should keep in the house of Black folk and not bring to the fray or not bring forward to the public. And to some extent, some people might still feel that way. And I definitely have a politics around that where I am concerned about the kinds of stories that we tell to certain publics, especially when we are dealing with institutions. But I'm also concerned about the way that we scapegoat certain figures in the stories that we do tell. And that's also why I start with the Black maternal, and I realize that I have to be able to tell a story about the Black maternal that is not limited to literary critique. So in that way, I'm also a Black studies practitioner and realizing the limits of disciplinarity and really not embracing non-disciplinarity because I think it's radical, but because it's necessary. Like, the ways that we have had to live are not ways that are limited to one disciplinary field. If we limit it to just media studies, then we miss out on so much more. If we limit trying to tell stories of Black living only to literature, then we miss out on so many other kinds of literacy that is also relevant in whatever literary story we're trying to tell. So,
yeah, I mean, disciplines answer certain questions really, really well. And the different kinds of questions Black studies allows to be asked and the different ways of answering them. That was a fantastic testimony to that. And I also love the way that secretes into the classroom, and thinking about who and what is an intellectual, what is intellectual work. Also, your nephew's on blast for eternity in a podcast for screwing up in the classroom or whatever. I appreciate that. I have a 14-year-old, so I was like, that's right. Sternly
I was going
worded
through that before we
text.
started. I'm like, yes, we're going to have a conversation.
Well, as one of the last two questions I have for you, I am going to crack up about your nephew. Keep this audio for a long time for him. So I wanted to ask you, when you look at the history of the field of Black studies, what do you think the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah, I think some things that Black studies has done really well, whether we agree with how it's done that or not, I think it's done a great job of really building an enduring field, right? Like, Black studies has always been under attack, really from its inception in the university. And it's established a space from which we can, I think, mount a relatively good defense of the field of Black studies. And that defense is a space born out of activism that helped us create formal Black studies departments. But also, like, that activism reminds us that, we can't be limited to the space of the university. I think Black studies has done a great job in encouraging us to think about different kinds or expanding what we understand to be Black intellectual traditions because of the different subfields that constitute Black studies, right? And I'm thinking about Black, queer, and trans studies, different kinds of literary theory, Black geographies, art history, all of these subfields, Black feminist theory, like, all of these subfields offer so much depth to the different kinds of literacies that constitute the study of Black life and Black studies as a formal field. And there's so much left. There's so much still yet to be gleaned from these different areas of study. I think Black studies has done a great job of asking us to be generous and self-reflexive in our critiques and debates, and to never take our position for granted. And I think that mirrors the reality of Black life in so many ways. Some things that maybe Black studies could do better or is not done so well.
Always the hardest part of the question, but yeah.
Well, I think I'll go for the easy one here. Like, I think Black studies has a persistent gender problem. Like, I think that's pretty obvious to most people who have any critical working knowledge of gender. And I'm saying that discursively and in terms of praxis. Like, gender, in so many ways, it still remains sidelined, right? Like, I've read a number of books produced by folks maybe in the last 10 to 15 years that constitute the field of Black studies, or it approaches Black studies from one of its many subfields. And some of those books position themselves as doing the work of accounting for gender, oftentimes by virtue of simply mentioning a Black woman author, or assuming that because a person happens to be a Black woman, that they are doing the work of Black feminism. And in either of those cases, they're not really doing the work of taking gender seriously, because the mention of a woman, the mention of a Black woman, is not equate to you doing the hard work of thinking about gender. And so I think in that way, the field has a lot of growing to continue to do. And I think, Black feminism, a field that we revere quite a bit for its contributions to expansive thinking around gender and Blackness, that field too has a lot of its own work to do around gender and the way that it has really taken to the concept, I don't want to say concept, and the way that it's really taken to the category of Black woman as a sort of given category, as opposed to like the constructed category that it is, and really thinking about the implications of what it means to treat the category of Black woman as this stable space, as opposed to thinking about the actual long history of gender and Blackness that reminds us of how we arrive at the category of Black woman. It is not a category that is stable, or can even be adhered to in any stable capacity. That's a part of the history that my work is tending to and writing out. I think something else, bound up in all of this, right? Thinking about Black studies and its relationship to gender and the work that it still has to do. We really have to contend with the performative gestures that come out of people's concerns for whether or not they are doing gender and Blackness correctly. I think, people do this work of making these disingenuous nods to Black women writers as if they are doing the work of gender and Blackness in a way to appear to like be taking both Black feminism and Black gender thinking seriously. And I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing, because the intentionality is there. I just think that has a tendency to fall into the space of performativity, and it's something that does not have to be the case if we can be honest about the ways that we still have these really intricate, weird relationships to gender that we want to hold on to, and really question why we want to hold on to that relationship to gender. And I think the other thing that Black studies has not done well, and I hope that it can get better at, it's something that I think I mentioned. I have an article that was published by Antipode. I was told this morning that it was published. Part of what I'm saying in that article is that essentially Black studies has to be really concerned about the kinds of methods that it enacts when we're doing something that we call fieldwork. We want to really be concerned about doing this incessant work of revealing strategies of Black living and Black surviving for the purposes of building careers in an institution that will learn to perfectly co-opt these strategies of survival to make it even more difficult for Black living to happen. So I think that that's something, like really being concerned about the default of Black studies doing the work of revelation is something that we have to be concerned with as well.
Thank you for that answer. I was really struck by how so many elements of the sort of challenge that you want to put to Black studies, the things that the field has not done particularly well, or sort of new, sort of new responsibilities around questions of gender. These are aspects of intellectual inquiry that are part of so many fields, and I really think responding substantively to the kind of challenges that you posed just now, which I really love. I think everybody who hears this will have those challenges really put very clearly at their feet. It's an opportunity, I think, both for Black studies to have connection to other area studies and disciplines that are taking on those same kinds of questions or facing those same kind of challenges. And so I think there's an important connection moment there for Black studies, but also another moment for Black studies to display, what our thinking does with those kinds of challenges and questions that are distinctive, as you said, in terms of really reckoning in a deep and profound way with Black life. So this is a long way of saying thank you for that. I think those are really important and intense challenges, and I really appreciate you bringing them to us. And it may be already partially an answer to this last question that I have, which is, in terms of Black studies in that sort of frame and horizon, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I think one of the issues that Black studies has to take seriously, and I think has, kind of been all over our conversation, is we really have to begin to question more seriously, and I think we maybe be more proactive about thinking about the stakes of institutionalization. And that concern is one that brackets a lot of things under what seems like one question, right? I think Black studies has always taken this question seriously, or certainly so many people who we might characterize as Black studies thinkers have taken this question seriously in as long as it's been a formal field in the university structure. And, because of the shifts that happen with the university itself, our orientation towards this question has also shifted. And as we've said, the current climate that we're in demands that we kind of reset our orientation towards this question in a very serious way, and in a way that cannot be reduced. The seriousness cannot be reduced. We have to understand, what does it mean to question the stakes of institutionalization? That means really building what does it mean to really build a sustainable relationship, or to continuously be accountable to communities outside of the university that help to create and sustain something we call Black studies, if that is by virtue of giving us material for other kinds of stories to tell, if it is by virtue of the kinds of people who will enter into the academy and take up the field of Black studies in a very serious way. We have to think about how we want something like Black studies to do more than simply survive the times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the stakes of institutionalization will force us, if not force, certainly encourage us to imagine bigger, to dream bigger about what something like Black studies can entail. And I think that's a place where many of us want to land, because we have so much to say about Black living, or something that will be characterized as Black studies. And not all of us want to do that under the guise of being concerned or prioritizing the work of resistance, when there are so many other kinds of stories to tell, or that we want to tell. So yeah, I think that's, taking the stakes of institutionalization seriously is something that Black studies has to do. And we have to remember that, as I've said, I think the concern for this has always been a part of people's work, whether it's central or peripheral. We're in a moment where it can no longer be considered peripheral in any capacity. So,
We are in a life or death moment around that exact question. So, uh, really well put, and really a great place for us to end this conversation, which I've really loved this conversation. Thank you so much, Jazz. I was really excited to talk with you, and this has just been an excellent conversation. There's so much in here about your work, about the history and future of the field that's going to give everybody who listens a lot to think about. And, another reason why, especially in this moment, this note on which you're concluding here, a reminder of why it is so important to get a PhD in the field. I mean, because this is not, some of us don't have anywhere else to go, and so this is a question about real past and future in the deepest way, and you've infused all of these questions with such ethical and political significance. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you making your time, and I'm so glad to have this as a contribution to the series.
thank you so much for having me. I have really enjoyed sitting with these questions and responding to them in as kind of way as I possibly can, even though I was terribly anxious. I'm really excited that we did have the opportunity to have this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
You as well.
All right, bye-bye.